Good evening, everybody. My name is Jeff Garrett. I'm the Chief Executive of the U.S. Study Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening to an event that I don't think could be better timed or more importantly timed. Our special guest, sitting to my left, is Dr. Edward Leamer, who's Chauncey Medbury Professor of Management, Economics, and Statistics at the UCLA Anderson School of Management, where he also directs the influential Anderson Economic Forecast. Ed is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Econometrics Society. He's also a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, the organization in the US that decides when there's a recession, although I know Ed's a little bit critical of how the NBER acts. He's been a visiting scholar at the IMF and in the US Federal Reserve System. As I said, the Anderson Economic Forecast is an influential voice in the US. And under Ed's direction for most of the last decade, the Anderson Forecast has been out in the lead of some very important trends in the US. In particular, the Anderson Forecast was the first major forecast in the US to suggest that the dot-com bubble in America was about to burst in the early 2000s and that this would lead to a recession. And then subsequently, Anderson, under Ed's leadership, has been a long and consistent voice saying two things about the post-9/11 American economy. The first one is that housing is more important to American business cycles than most people think. And second, that the US was blowing up a large housing bubble for most of this decade. I think I said last time I introduced Ed that he first predicted a housing-based recession in 2005, and he wanted to tell me that it was actually 2002 when he first warned of the real estate bubble in the US. So to my left is somebody who's a extremely well-known and high-quality economist, but as I said to a group earlier today, also one of a declining breed of economists who believes that speaking about using the high-end econometric tools that the discipline has developed is important, but applying them to problems in the real world is even more important. So it's, as I said, it's a real pleasure for me to be on the stage with Ed today. The way we're going to structure this evening's proceedings is very simple and as follows. I'll start off by trying to provoke Ed into some big picture reflections on what's going on in the United States and what it means for all of us. And we'll do that for about half an hour. And after that, I hope that there'll be enough food for thought on the table for many of you to come to the microphones we have placed here so that you can ask Ed any questions you might have. I already will just say in advance that if you ask him how deep is the Australian recession going to be and how long will it last, he'll give you some answer that says, I'm not in any position to talk about Australia. So the way we might structure it is to think about what is going on in the US and what it means for the world, rather than asking him to opine on whether it was a good idea for the Reserve Bank not to cut Australian interest rates today. So I know that would be headline grabbing, but Ed, I know Ed likes to have touch and feel of the numbers, and he doesn't have touch and feel of the Australian numbers, so I don't think he'll want to opine on that. So let me start off by talking about two streets in the United States, Wall Street and Main Street. In Australia, and I think the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, has been a lead player in this story. We don't talk so much about an American recession. What we talk about is a global financial crisis. Australians love acronyms, so this is already the GFC. And the conventional story in Australia about what's going on in the world is that it's all about Wall Street greed. with multi-millionaires recklessly gambling away people's hard-earned money and dragging not only America but the world down with them. So greed, excess, irresponsibility focused on Wall Street is the story. But I know you think that America's problems started in the real economy, and in particular with housing, and that any economic recovery in the US will also start in the real economy, maybe adding Americans buying automobiles and going to restaurants to buying houses again. So, two questions. Why do you think the real economy is the bigger story than Wall Street and the financial sector? And second, why do you think the problem in the US, but as I said, in Australia too, is portrayed more as a Wall Street problem, which inevitably means that stories about the real economy and Main Street are underemphasized? So, Wall Street, Main Street, and how it's spun.
Okay, first I want to say thanks for inviting me to this great city and this great country. And I very much appreciate the introduction, some of it which was actually true. With regard to Wall Street and Main Street, the financial sector versus the real economy, maybe I'll tell you a little story. So I read in the Los Angeles Times that $10 trillion worth of wealth was destroyed, meaning housing valuations went down and equity values went down. And I found that was a very alarming statement. The word was destroyed. So I got in my car in Los Angeles and I drove to San Francisco, to Denver, to St. Louis, to Chicago, to Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., and Boston. I was trying to find out where the earthquakes, fires, and floods were that destroyed all that wealth. And in that long journey, I had a lot of time to think about it. And it occurred to me that the LA Times is just talking about numbers on hard drives. They're just numbers on hard drives. As painful as it may be if you find out that your portfolio isn't worth what it was, it's still just a number on a hard drive, and it matters only to the extent that you translate that into actual behavior, into spending. So that gets me into this is going to be kind of a long answer. You have to jump in.
I'll interrupt you.
Okay.
As I deem appropriate.
Good. There are two metaphors for thinking about the relationship between Wall Street and Main Street, or the relationship between the financial economy and the real economy. One is the shadow, and the other is the grease. The shadow metaphor goes something like this. There's a real economy, which is offices, factories, families, growing older, having children, on and on. You can touch it and feel it and smell it. It's the real economy. And that real economy casts a shadow, which we call Wall Street, the financial shadow. Sometimes the shadow is long and sometimes it's short. When the shadow is shortening, the folks whose business is to sell the shadow get extremely upset and imagine that the real economy is getting smaller as well. But a lot of times you get movement in the shadow, even though the real economy is completely intact. That's my point about my travels around the United States. The productive assets of the United States are totally intact.
The productive assets are intact, but I'll tell you my personal story. I mean, you're a smarter guy than I am. But I moved to Sydney from Los Angeles last year, owning a house in West LA, and because my house was worth much less than I paid for it several years ago, I didn't want to sell it. So that has big implications for my life. In particular, I can't buy a house in Australia, maybe. The second thing is, as so many people, not only in the US but in Australia have, I've got a retirement nest egg. And I now see that my retirement nest egg is only worth 60% of what it was worth last year. Yes, those things are on paper, but by God, they affect my behavior. Isn't that the point here?
You hit upon what is a real phenomenon inside the United States and indeed probably on a global scale. There's been a massive transfer from the elderly in favor of the next generation, meaning that the next generations of global citizens are going to be able to buy the productive assets of the globe at much cheaper prices. You sound like you're on the wrong end of that bargain because
I'm feeling older every day. What can I say?
Let's continue the Wall Street versus Main Street. The story that Wall Street wants to tell is not the shadow story, which makes them seem kind of immaterial and unimportant, is their story is a Greece story, which is that the lending that the financial community does is absolutely essential for the functioning of a modern economy. And without that lending, the economy would grind to a halt.
Well, they've done a pretty good job of selling that.
Yeah.
You know, George Bush and Barack Obama don't agree about much, but they agree about that.
Yeah, I
What's
agree.
wrong with the story that says that lending is the grease that makes the economy go?
Well, you have to look at that as a potential cause for an economic recession. So let's roll the clock back to really 2007 in August when you had the first problem with commercial paper market. And a lot of people at that time rightly said that there's going to be losses on Wall Street. The highly leveraged firms are going to have to pull in the loans and assets, and that would cause this terrible lending problem. Well, then you have to look at the balance sheets and find out which balance sheets are troubled and which are okay. If you think there are three balance sheets, there's personal balance sheets. That means your assets and liabilities, your home and the mortgages possibly. Then there are the corporate balance sheets, the non-financial corporate and the financial corporate. The non-financial corporate balance sheets were very strong in the United States, very strong earnings, high levels of profits. The cash on hand in U.S. corporations exceeded the indebtedness. So it didn't seem, based on the data from the Federal Reserve Board, that corporate America was much in need of lending from the financial sector. And then that gets us to the important point. The consumer balance sheets have been in dismal shape because the United States has been under-saving, overspending for a long period of time. First because of the dot-com boom that made us all feel incredibly wealthy, like there was no reason to save. And then when that failed, we had the housing bubble that again did the same thing. That when your home is going up by 10 or 20 or 30% per year, you don't have to save. In fact, people were refinancing, pulling money out and buying cars and boats and having fancy parties. So now that we got the end of that, so suddenly there's a comeuppance, there's an awareness that Americans have not prepared for the future because we don't have any savings. We're not a bunch of young kids. The average age is high and it's getting higher, yet we have not been saving to accumulate for retirement. And
okay, but then we get to a paradox, and this would be my next question. I think I've heard you say, and many people say, that Americans, and probably people in most of the rest of the Western world, need to save more, but they need to save more gradually, not all at once. So let me now ask you about optimism, pessimism, and leadership. So I know you believe that America's fundamental problem today, which seems so ironic given our normal views of Americans, is a crisis of confidence. Americans just aren't very confident, so it's not a real problem, it's a psychological problem, and that leadership is the big story here, or leadership is potentially the alchemical thing that turns the US around. You know, you're a master of the dismal science, economics. You stare at numbers all day, every day. You love trends. Why do you think confidence and leadership are so important?
We thought that the big risk for the U.S. economy is that consumers would all at the same time decide they weren't as wealthy as they thought they were and would cut back spending. But in order for that to happen, there has to be a coordinating mechanism. And we just didn't see that on the horizon. So we thought that Joe down the street would realize that he had to cut back spending next month, and Harry would realize a week later, and Jeff a couple of months later, and there'd be a period of sluggish economic growth, but there wouldn't be a coordinated cutback in spending. And therefore, we thought the second half of 2008 in the United States would be about like the first half, which was disappointing growth, a disappointing labor market. But the United States, which was stumbling forward through September, completely fell off the cliff in September. So you look around to try to find out what it is that happened, and the timing is almost exactly after that TARP bill was first proposed and then passed.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's take ourselves back to early September 2008. Barack Obama and John McCain were neck and neck in the polls. In fact, after Americans like Australians were infatuated with Sarah Palin, McCain was ahead in the polls. Right. George Bush, the master of optimism, kept saying that the world was going well, and John McCain was mimicking him, saying the fundamentals of the US economy are still sound, I think is the quotation. Then the world seems to have fallen in. The infamous Monday, September 15th, the US government allows Lehman Brothers, venerable financial institution, to fail, having bailed out some other big banks. A few days later, they announced that they're going to put an unheard of $700 billion into the US banking system. And Henry Paulson says, I'm a decisive guy, I'm a leader, this is what I'm going to do. I know you're part of the growing chorus that's very critical of that period, that weak period. But there are some other stories out there about the cause of the crisis, so I wanted to see if you might want to sort of try to apportion responsibility here. So let me say that there might be 3 other stories about what caused the current problems. And maybe that one was the one that tipped everything over. The first story, which is Martin Wolf's story from the Financial Times in London, is China did it. China's been manipulating exchange rates forever. Exports are the lifeblood of the Chinese economy. They want to sell to the United States. The only way to do that is to keep buying treasury bills. So this is what Ben Bernanke, as you remember, called politely the global savings glut. So that's story 1. China did it. Story 2 says Greenspan did it. The problem is that Alan Greenspan always thought the glass was half full, loved free markets, and let US monetary policy remain too lax and interest rates be too low in the early 2000s when you and others were saying, wait a second, there's another bubble growing here. And the third explanation says, no, that's not true. The big story is George Bush, and the problem with George Bush was that he had no interest in regulating financial markets. So those are sort of 3 structural stories. It's China's position in the global economy, Alan Greenspan's over-optimism about free markets, and George Bush's unwillingness to regulate markets versus this kind of triggering, boy, September 2008 was a bad month. How would you, in retrospect, how do you think we're going to view this?
Well, you more or less answered your own question because you used the word trigger. So these 3 other causes are all contributors to the fragility of the U.S. economy and the necessity of sluggish growth as consumers improve their balance sheets. But they don't create a coordinated mechanism. That's a recipe for sluggish growth. Although I wouldn't blame the Chinese are co-conspirators in this because it was American consumers and the American government that were borrowing intensely. So if you have a borrower and a lender that are engaged in an inappropriate transaction that you look from the outside, it seems inappropriate. Do you want to blame it on the lender or do you want to blame it on the borrower? I think the borrower has to take primary responsibility. It's very low savings rates in the United States. Greenspan, definitely. If you want me to identify the perps and have a perp walk, Mr. Greenspan is front and center as far as I'm concerned. And then it's the rating agencies. But that builds up the fragileness of the economy. It doesn't precipitate it into the downturn. What precipitates it is something that coordinates consumers all at once to cut back at the same time. And the story, as you said, is that the Lehman Brothers led to some highly unusual data in the financial sector with the treasuries going down to zero, the yields on short-term treasuries going down to zero, and the euro-dollar rate going up. And the reason going way up. And the reason is that everybody wanted to put their money in the only bank that they could trust because Lehman suddenly became insolvent, and they imagined every other bank in the world is probably insolvent as well. If you got deposits in an insolvent bank, you're not going to be able to get them out. So Uncle Sam was the only one you could trust. That meant buying in short-term treasuries. Then the European banks in the euro-dollar market, in order to attract deposits, had to have much higher rates. So that explains that huge increase in what's called the TED spread between the LIBOR, euro-dollar rate, and the Treasury. And Paulson and Bernanke are saying, oh my God, Their job was to make sure that the United States economy would percolate through all this crisis. But all of a sudden, something terrible had happened on their watch, and they said, we got to do something. And Paulson, who for ideological reasons does not want to nationalize the bank, so he didn't want to do the capital infusion, which was the correct solution, because the way you deal with the solvency problem is by being transparent about the assets that are on the banks and making sure that the banks that need more assets are going to have it by virtue of a capital injection. Paulson apparently didn't want to do that, and so he was insistent on this ill-defined plan, half-baked plan, not even half-baked, not a plan at all, about how they might acquire the distressed assets, the mortgage-backed securities, and remove that from the bank's balance sheets.
Okay, so Henry Paulson said, and Congress ultimately approved a deal that said, listen, I want you to give me a small number, $700 billion. Oh, and by the way, you can't ask me what I'm going to do with it, and I'm free to change my mind on what I'm going to do with it.
He didn't ask to have that inserted. So hardly anybody knew at the time, but the original plan that Paulson proposed was a 3-page plan that was limited to purchasing mortgage-backed securities, but this was expanded into a 500-page thing that the Congress put together, and inserted in there was 1 or 2 sentences that allowed Paulson actually to do the capital infusion. But the important point that we didn't get back to is those characters went to the U.S. Congress and went to the American people and said if we didn't pass this bill by Friday, we were going to have a repeat of the Great Depression. And it just scares everybody.
Right, which was quite a remarkable thing for George Bush, who never in 7 years of his presidency had said anything bad was happening. He was the most upbeat guy in the world, then turned into a prophet of doom on one day to sell this bank bill.
Yeah, although if you read what he said, he says the experts say that if this bill isn't passed, bad things could happen. That's more or less this rhetoric that he uses. It's contrasted enormously from Franklin Roosevelt's rhetoric when he became president in March of 1933. When his inauguration was in March at that time. Shortly thereafter, there was runs on the banks. He closed the banks, and he gets on the fireside radio. He does one of his chats on the radio, and he says a very powerful rhetoric saying that there's something in a financial system that's more important than gold, and that's the confidence of the people. And you people must not be driven by fear and rumor. You must have confidence that I'm taking care of this problem, but I can't do it alone. I need your help. I need you to have confidence in the system. Together we cannot fail. Now, I didn't do that as well as FDR did, but it's...
Well, I'm not going to ask you to try Barack Obama, but I know you thought Barack Obama's speech last week, his mini State of the Union, was a characteristically wonderful Obama speech that had much more optimism than he'd been expressing in the previous few weeks in his weekly addresses and things. But I want to ask you about sort of confidence and leadership versus policy detail. So you and many other people think that the Paulson $700 billion bailout plan was a bad plan. And you think that Obama is providing good leadership in the U.S., but Obama not only said, I'll see your $700 billion Paulson plan, he's now said, gee, I might have to double that amount. So the TARP number, whatever TARP stands for, bank bailout number, could go to 1.4 trillion or something like that. And his Treasury Secretary, when he tried to announce what the Obama administration would do with this, led to a 10% and growing decline in the U.S. stock market. So what's the difference between Barack Obama and George Bush on this one, on bank bailouts?
Well, words matter. Words really do matter. And Barack Obama is an extraordinary orator, and he says all the right things. But then, as you would suggest, you've got to deliver at some point. And I think there's great problems because we still haven't seen the Geithner plan with regard to how to deal with the financial sector. We had a huge meltdown yet again on the equities markets in the United States. It went down by another 3 or 4% around the globe. I think that has to do with AIG, where AIG is just sucking money out from the taxpayers' purses in the United States, and there's no end in sight. You don't see that our leaders have any kind of control of the system. They seem to be putting out fires. You have another fire, they try to put out that, and they run and put another one. There's no kind of coherent plan. They have not articulated a clear plan. Geithner, who was involved in this from the very beginning and is now our secretary, he was Secretary of the Treasury, he was involved with it as the president of the New York Fed, he still doesn't know what to do. I mean, Obama one day said he doesn't want to give away what Secretary Geithner is going to say the next day, and the next day Secretary Geithner doesn't say anything.